Hello and welcome to level 4 of this API project. In this level, we will be redoing our connection to the database because we just did it using SQL, but now I would like to do it using a tool called an ORM. And I have just found this article from Free Code Camp that explains what an ORM is, and I'll just only touch upon it in brief details. Of course, you should expand your knowledge and research this further, but this is just to give you some inspiration. But an ORM stands for an object relational mapping. And the thing that it does is that it creates kind of like a bridge between your object-oriented code and your database. And this means that using an ORM, you don't have to type SQL statements by yourself any longer. Instead, you will have this ORM object that will be able to execute SQL statements on your behalf. And this is very nice because it saves you from making wrong SQL statements and typing this SQL by yourself. I am by no means a master of SQL, so I'm very happy that I can use tools like this. Of course, it's important that you know how SQL works under the hood, because that is actually what is just going on. The ORM tool will create SQL statements for you and execute them, but you don't have to write them yourselves. But underneath, it is still SQL. So still, I encourage you to fully understand SQL and how you work with relational databases. But nonetheless, that's not the focus of this video. The focus is more to give you an inspiration and get you started such that you can see how this works and then you can further expand upon your knowledge. But enough talking, let's jump right into it. The ORM tool that we're going to use is called Prisma, and you can install it by doing npm I and then save and then Prisma like this. And we also need one more thing from Prisma, and that is going to be the client. And you get it by, again, installing like this, but then doing an add Prisma and then /client. And then once we have that installed, there's one more thing I would like you to install, and that is just the extension for Prisma. So if you go to VS Code, get the extensions and click install on this one for Prisma, then it will give you a more easy time working with Prisma schemas that we will be defining in very short moment. So now that I have that installed, we can go ahead and find the documentation for Prisma. And let me just find the beginning of this one, and we want to do a relational database. So this is the guide on how to get started from Prisma. If you go to Prisma, the main page, and you click on get started, and then you go down to the PostgreSQL, you should jump into a small guide that shows you how you get started with Prisma. But I'll just quickly run through it and grab the important things. Of course, look through this yourself if you're interested and curious to know more. But the thing that we need to do after we have installed Prisma is to do an npm Prisma init. And this will then start a Prisma project in our directory and get us all the files that we need. So we do npm Prisma and then init. And this will now do a couple of things. I'm sorry, I have to do this with npx Prisma init. And this will now give you two things. First of all, it will give you a Prisma directory with a schema.prisma file in it. And secondly, it will create a .env file. And this is an environment file which are used to store values that are specific to your environment. And the environment means if you are currently developing or if your product is already in production, that would be a different environment. And that's because you normally have endpoints, databases, and all this good stuff that are different when you're in development from the ones that you use in production. Of course, you don't use the development database in production. That's why you have different environments. And important variables and important values to your environment you store in this .env file. So Prisma has created this env file, and they have put a comment in here saying that they have created it. And as you can see, we have one variable called database URL. This will be our connection string that we use to connect to the database. So let's just go ahead and grab our real database connection string from the service that we created previously. So in the DB service, we have defined the connection string as being this string, which we got from Neon Tech, which is our online PostgreSQL database. So instead of having this one, I will now post in my real connection string. So now that I have that ready, I will close down the env file because we don't have to worry so much about that anymore. let's jump over to this schema.prisma file, because this one is also very important to touch upon. In here, you can see some Prisma specific things. You have your client and you have your database. And as you can see, or your data source, and we are saying that our provider, the kind of data source that we have, will be PostgreSQL, and that the URL will be our environment variable. And this is how we grab the value from our environment variable from this file. And we grab that and we get the one called database URL, because that is the name of this variable. And then our data source is actually ready. The only thing that we need now is a model for our book. We need to specify a table and specify how our books will look in this table. So we did this previously when we created the table directly with SQL, but now instead of using SQL statements to create it, we'll use this Prisma model. And let me just go ahead and grab this, because I already have it over here. And this is then the model for the book. This is how we define that a book table, what it should look like. So the book table is going to have an ID, which will be an integer. And this will be the ID, which in Prisma terms means that this will be like the primary key. This is how we uniquely identify a book. It is using the ID. And we will, by default, give this ID if it is not specified, if it is not added when we insert a book, it will just create one and auto increment it. So very similar to what we had before. Every time we insert a book, we don't provide an ID, but we just get the next ID that we got to. So if we have 2 books already, the next ID would be 3. And then we specify that the title will be a string, the author will be a string, and the published variable will be a Boolean, which will default to false. So if we don't specify this, it will just be false by automatically. So now that we have our model, we can go ahead and complete the connection to our Prisma database. So if we jump back over to the to the documentation for Prisma, we have now done the init, and we have our file, our Prisma file, we have our environment file. We can go to the next step, which is connecting the database. And as you can see, this just tells you about how you should put this connect string into the environment variable. And we actually already did that, so we will continue to the migrate step. And the migrate step will take this model that we have just defined and actually create a table in the database for us using this specification. So the way we do it is that we grab this command from here and paste it in here. And let me just go through it. Okay, I didn't have time to go through it, but what it does is that it will migrate, and a migration is a word that means that you're changing your database. Every time you do a migration, it means that you are changing the settings or the tables of your database. So what we're doing here, let me just scroll up, is that we are calling the npx, or we're calling the Prisma migrate dev command, and then we're specifying a name for this migration, which we just call init, because this will be our first migration. And when I enter this, it will start running, and it takes some time, but it's going to get the environment variables from the .env file. And as you can see, it has gotten this information from that environment variable. These are coming from our connection string. And now it's going to tell us that it has detected drift, and it means that our database and our schema, our table, is currently different. So the one that we already created manually in the previous level is different from what it's going to create now, and they cannot exist side by side. So it is asking us if we want to remove the current one and add the new one. So as it's saying here, we need to reset the public schema. And because we're just developing, we don't have any production data, this is all right to do. We can just wipe what we had before and just start over. It is not a problem. Of course, you should be very careful if you do this in production, and you have to learn more about this before you start putting it into production. But for now, it is fine that we are resetting the schema and using this Prisma instead of using our old table. So just it is just, for me, I would just like to tell you that you should always be careful when you're making these migrations, because you're changing the way that your data is being kept. But for now, this is fine, as it's saying all data will be lost. That is what we will accept that, and we press yes, or just the Y button, and it will then continue on to create this table for us. And this will just take a small while, and once it's done, we will continue creating our service. Good. And as you can see, it has now created a migration, and it also inside the Prisma directory creates a new directory called migrations. And if you take a look at this one, it has, this is the date of today, and it includes an SQL file. And this is actually the SQL that it used in order to create this table for us. So every time we do a migration, we will always get the SQL that was behind it, so that you can see what it is that was actually executed. And this is the SQL that this migration used. So let's close that down. We now have our connection, and we have our database and our table set up to use our Prisma. So the next thing is to create a new database service class that uses this Prisma object, or that uses the Prisma tool. So the way that we do that will be to touch, and let's make a new file that we will call db prisma service.ts. And let's open up this one, the Prisma service. And this will be very similar to our old database service, but instead of using PG, this package that we used before, instead of using that and querying with custom-made SQL statements, we will be using Prisma instead. So let's create a new class. Let's do class, and we'll call this db prisma service, like this. And this one is going to have a Prisma client. So instead of the PG pool that we have here, we will make something similar, but it's the Prisma client. So we'll do a private, and we'll just call it Prisma, and set this equal to a new Prisma client like this. And then we call the constructor. So now we have an import to the Prisma client. Next, let's create a function where we can insert a book into the Prisma client, or into our database using the Prisma client. So let's make a public function that we will call insert book, very similar to before. This one will of course take an input, which will be a book, which will be title, which will be a string, an author, which will also be a string, and this published, which will be a boolean. So just like before. And then we can use the Prisma client. So we do this.prisma.book, because the Prisma client knows that we have a table called book. So we can say, and remember, this book is different from the input parameter up here. So we say this.prisma.book to get the book table. And then we can do .create. And this is all Prisma syntax. So you have to look up the documentation in Prisma to find out how this works. But here we can then create a new book, and it will insert it into the database. The way you do it is that you provide it with an object, and this object has a key called data, and then you simply put in the data that you want as an object. And this will be the book that is coming in. And actually, Prisma will be returning the object that it just created for us. So we can put this in a variable called created book. And let's just await this one, because this is going to take a small while. So we'll make this an async function. And finally, let's return this created book. And over here, we can just say that the thing that we are returning will be a promise, which has a book inside of it. So notice that this is the book type that is coming from the database service. And this is actually the wrong type of book. So it is very important that we don't get this book, because this is the book that we defined in here. Instead, we want the book that is coming from our Prisma. So up here we do the book, and then we remove this one from the DB service, because they're different. I know they are named the same. Maybe they should not have been. We could name this one something else. Let's rename this to book creation. I think we'll just leave this. It's just important that you know that this is the book that is defined in our Prisma client. So this one. This is actually the book that we are returning. This is the type. So don't get the one from the DB service, get the one from the schema.prisma. Very important. So we will return this created book, and let's see if this works. So over in our server.ts, we can go ahead and grab our post request here to the books, and instead of using the DB service, let's now use the Prisma services instead. So we do an await, and we call DB Prisma service. Of course, we have to first export this one. So we'll do an export default equal export default new DB Prisma service like this. So we have a singleton of the DB Prisma service, and this one we'll call insert book, and we will insert this new book. And of course we could save this in a variable, because this one Prisma will actually return the book that it just created. So we will do created book and assign this to this. And then instead of returning all the books, let's just return just the created book like this. So now when we hit the books post endpoint and we try to input a book, instead of using the old DB service, we're now using the new DB Prisma service. So if we jump over to our postman and we try to post a book, let's try that. Click send, and hopefully this works. At least we got a good response, and we are told that this is the book that we just inserted, and we get a 201 created. And notice this is not an array of books, so we are actually just getting that single book that we just created. And again, if we look over here into our database online and we let it find the book schema or the book table, you can see this is the book that we just created. So this actually works, and we are now using this Prisma service instead. So we can just quickly compare these two side by side, and let's just get the DB service over here. So let me just zoom out. We have, and can I hide this minimap? Yes. So over here, when we have our insert book, here we do a manual query. We do the SQL query, we write this query ourselves. But over here, instead, we use the functions that are created, or the functions that exist on this Prisma client, in order to insert our book. So this I would prefer. I like this way more, but of course it's up to you. If you prefer to write the SQL yourself, you can just go ahead and do that. But I like this. It gives me more type safety. At least that's what I believe in. And I like how this is way more, for me, it makes way more sense to call functions like this. So that is how you can create the insert book using the Prisma. Of course, now I would like to encourage you to create all of the rest of these functions that we have in the old DB service. Try to create them in the Prisma service, but using Prisma, of course, instead of the SQL statements. That's a small challenge to you. And if you want to do it, I would be really happy. That's a good thing. But otherwise, I'll show you very soon, or just after this, I'll show you how you can make all the rest of these functions. Let's continue and add the rest of the functions that we need. So the next one that I will make is going to be the get books, which will just grab all the books from the array. So this will return a promise with an array of these books inside of it, like this. And the way that it's going to get them is, of course, using Prisma. So we can make a small variable called books and assign this to a call to this.prisma.book. Again, we are getting the books from the book table, and then we can do find many. And of course, all this stuff you find in the documentation. So if there's anything that you're confused about, or anything you want to know more about, just look up the documentation for Prisma and you'll find out how it works. And then of course we have to return these books. So that's actually quite simple. And let's go over to our server.ts, and instead of using the DB service, we are now going to use the DB Prisma service, but the rest will just be the same. So if we take a look over in Postman and we go to the get all books endpoint and we hit send, let's see if we get something. and we do get the book. We get that one book that we have in the database. So that is perfect. Let's continue and get one book using the ID. So let's just copy this function like this and get book by ID. Of course, we are going to need the ID. We have done this many times now, and this will return a book instead of a book array. And this time we're going to use a different function from the book table, and this will be called find unique. And the way that you do this now is that you do the round parentheses to call the function, then you specify an object, and in here you can type where, and here you have your where clause. And where will then again be an object, because you can specify many things, but we want the ID to be equal to the ID. So on the left here, which is the key of this where object, we have the ID from the table, and on the left, on the right, we have the ID coming in from the parameter. We could also rename this to underscore ID, for example, just to make sure that you can see that these are different. But if they're actually called the same, we can also just omit the key and just do ID like this. And let's call this one book, and then just return book. All right, let's see what is up. It is complaining that it's not so this is because is this find unique? It might not find it. What happens if we are searching for an ID that doesn't exist? So Prisma is telling us that this might not return a real book, because if you're searching for a book that doesn't exist, it cannot find it. The thing that we want to do is to, instead of using just find unique, we're going to use find unique or throw. And this means that if it cannot find this ID that we're searching for, it will instead throw an error. And of course, we need to handle this error. We're not going to do that in this level. We'll do that in a further level where we do error handling. But for now, this is what we want to do. And we now know that this function will always return a book, or else it is going to throw an error. So now we have no more errors, and we can go back to the server.ts. We can edit our books endpoint and use the Prisma service instead. And everything should work exactly like before. Let's jump over to our postman and try to get a book by ID. We can see that from the all books endpoint, we only have one book with the ID of 1. So let's try to get that book. And if we click send, we should now get that first book, and we do. So that works perfectly. And the next function that we're going to make is going to be the update function. And again, because this logic is a bit more complex, a little bit more tricky, I'm going to just grab the code I have written previously and then explain it to you. Again, this is a very good challenge for you. Try to make this on your own. So you go ahead and do that now if you want, or else just keep watching. So I'm going to paste in this function called update book by ID. It, of course, takes 2 parameters, an ID and then this book update. And instead of calling this book, I would like to call it update instead. And as you can see, it is exactly like the type that we defined in the previous level. So we could also just use that type. But let's just go ahead with what we have right now. And then I do something similar to the last level where we wanted to find all the keys that actually have a value. So first off, I create a map. And this map is going to include all the types that or all the values that I'm going to need. Because we're not making this SQL statement by ourselves, we cannot concatenate and put together this SQL statement, because instead we have to provide the data that we would like to update. So what I want to do is now that I want to create an object that only has the values that are actually going to update. And I don't want to include those that are undefined, because if I put in an object with undefined values, we're going to try to put undefined into our table. So we don't want that. So the thing that I do is I, again, iterate over all the keys, and then for each key, I check if a value is present. And if it is present, then in my map, I set this, I set the key and the value equal to the key and the value. But I only do it if there was an actual value. So if this was undefined, then we skip it. Then down here, where we start to do the Prisma update, I have my where clause. So I'm trying to do a book.update. So instead of a book.create, as we have in the insert, we do a book.update. And then we have to specify an object, and this object has a where clause, so we can specify which ID or which element in the table that we want to update. It's of course the one with the ID, which equals our ID. And the data is then going to be the data that we want to update. But if I just pasted in the whole update object in here, then if some of them were undefined, if some of the values were undefined, then we're going to try to put undefined into this, into the database for this entry. And we don't want that. So instead, we only want to do it for the ones that have a value. And that's why we created this map and iterated through all the keys. And for each of the key, if there was a corresponding value, then we added that to the map. And then finally, I am going to create an object from this map, and this object is then the object that we're going to give to the data property in the Prisma. So all in all, this is again a little bit complex, but the goal is just to create an update function where you can provide it with only the values that you want to update, and you can decide to omit the values that you don't want to update. And this is what we have achieved with this. So let's go over to the server.ts and let's find our update function. And here we can just do not DB service, but instead we do the DB Prisma service. And this function, because we're using Prisma, it will actually return the book that we just updated. It will return the new entry in the database. So we can return that. And this also means that our updated book that we get back will be put into this variable that we can then return to the client. So let's go ahead and look at our Postman and try to update this one with the ID 1. Let's just try to update the title. So if we go over here and we remove these two and just update the title and we click send, let's see if we get an updated. Yes, now we get back the ID, still 1. We have a new title, but we still have the old author and the old published value. Let's try to also change the author and the published. So if we hit send, then we also change the author. And this is working just like we intended and just like before, but instead of creating this query string ourselves, we are now just using Prisma. And finally, we need the last function, which is going to be the delete function. And this is also a little simple one. I will just copy it again, so you don't have to wait for me to type it out. And this one is again simple. It's very much like the find book, find unique, where we get the book by ID. It's very similar because now we just delete the book with the ID. So exactly the same, but instead of find unique or throw, we just do a delete where the ID equals the ID. So, and that's it. And let's just remember to also use it over here in the delete. So over here we have the DB Prisma service, and we have this one called delete book. Let's just call it delete book by ID just for consistency. So delete book by ID. And that was it. We have now transformed we have created a new database service with Prisma, and we now have an ORM, and you now try to implement an ORM using the schema where you define how the table and what the model of this type should be. And you have actually applied it to your online SQL database, Postgres database, and you have switched your API to using this ORM instead of using the old database service with SQL. So really good job, awesome work. And I hope you learned something and had fun in the meanwhile. And then I'll just see you in the next level.